Well, thanks, Pranay. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I thank Pranay now as organizer. I'll thank him later as collaborator. So today I'm going to give you a few snippets of the work we have been doing for the last 2 years on trying to understand how calcium aluminosilicates dissolve. So it's my first time at ACI, so I thought I would give you a quick roundabout about my background and what we do in my lab. So I'm a civil engineer by training. So concrete is near and dear to my heart. I spent my PhD and my postdoc working on problems related to material science. If you have talked to any material scientist, concrete is not a material. So I thought that I would bring all that expertise back to the field. And in 2019, I started my lab at the University of Miami, where our goal is basically to understand how nanostructured materials behave. How the structure of them makes them have the properties that they have. The idea is to use this fundamental understanding to make them better. And concrete obviously is a nanostructured material. We use multiscale simulation techniques, theory, and data-driven approaches on occasion. These floating heads are my students. The work that I'm going to show today has been done by Subhashari Panda, a PhD in my group, who's there in the back. Meili Lu, who's a postdoc. Our guiding principle, I have seen versions of this code today through the sessions. This is your speedbox, and all models are wrong, but some are useful. We are interested in mechanistic understanding trends. We are not looking for the model of everything. I'm not trying to get quantitative comparison to experiments at every level to the third decimal place. I care about the how things happen. We are particularly interested in messy systems. So today I'm going to tell you about our work on glasses, which is funded by NSF. But we are also doing some work on high entropy alloys for electrocatalysts. These ones, instead of having a disordered structure, you have configurational disorder. We are interested in other messy systems like bacterial biofilms, which it goes beyond just the structure, and you have biological phenotypic heterogeneity, etc. So today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work we have been doing on glasses, okay? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time motivating why are we doing this. So the idea is that substituting in Portland cement with SCMs is a good way to contribute to the mitigation of carbon emissions, as well as other beneficial effects. So you are probably familiar with SCMs at that scale. How I see SCMs is more or less at the scale of the bottom left. So if you are not familiar with how it's like CAS glasses, calcium aluminosilicate glasses look at the molecular scale, you can think about the aluminosilicate occupying the center of this tetrahedra. The tetrahedra have oxygens at the vertex, and these tetrahedra are coordinated to each other, forming a network. In that network, calcium, what it does, it breaks these bridges between the silica and alumina. So it turns out that most of the reactive phases of SCMs consist primarily of calcium aluminosilicate glasses. There is obviously some other oxides. And we have a presentation before that was talking a little bit about maybe the potential important role of these other oxides. We are focusing on CAS glasses as model systems because real SCMs are already very complicated. And I hope I don't have to convince you very hard that understanding the relationship between the composition, the structure, and the reactivity of the glasses is important to understand how current SCMs work and to develop new ones. Sometimes develop doesn't mean creating them in the lab, it's identifying new ones, right? And I want to highlight here the role of the structure too. I have seen a lot of talks, and I think the general move of using machine learning is to bypass everything in the middle and say, how can I predict from composition properties? And this may be a little hard. So we are going to take an intermediate step. So how we start? We start with experimental data. This is data collected by Suba. Pranay co-advises these students, so thank you now as collaborator. What you are seeing here is heat release normalized by surface area as a function of time on the left. And what you're seeing on the right is where these glasses are in the compositional space. And I just wanted to point out that you can pick two glasses that have very similar composition, so similar stoichiometry. The reactivity is very different. Both the kinetics and the sort of long-term heat release, so 72 hours. So you can already, by looking at this data, see that composition is not the full story. There's something else, right? And it's here where you have trouble using experiments to answer these questions. And here is where simulation comes in and can give you, hopefully, some insight into what's happening. Now, I'm not saying that the stoichiometric descriptors are completely useless. They actually are potentially interesting in some regions of this space, and there's some trends, but they cannot explain everything. So how I look at the hydration process. This is a cartoonist representation, but you have particles of CAS glass in water. They dissolve, so once you have the ions in solution, so that dissolution process releases some heat, then the ions dissolve, and they precipitate and grow into the hydrates, right? So that's a semi-stable phase. After dissolution, they form CAS or whatever other hydration products. This process from first principles is very hard to impossible to simulate. Not just the length scales, the time scales. Okay, so what I'm gonna focus now is on the part on the left, on dissolution. So this is part of the hydration process, right? It's not the full story either. Dissolution itself is a complicated process across scales. So at the very fundamental level, you have that the dissolution of these glasses proceeds through the dissociation of those bridges, right? So you have bridges between silica and silica, silica and alumina, alumina and alumina, and water acts as a nucleophile that breaks those bridges. So if you have sequential dissociation of bridges, eventually you have a silica or an aluminum ion going into solution, okay? Now, if you go, that would be about 1 nanometer scale. Here on the right, you have techniques. So these are computational techniques that would be appropriate to get insight on that scale, okay? So at the 1 nanometer level, you will have that, you can use ab initio methods to gain insight into the reactivity, the dissociation of these bridges. And I'll show you later a little bit of the work we have been doing at this scale. Now, you go beyond that, beyond the one bridge or a few bridges, and look at a system like this one on the left. This would be about 3 nanometer size. So what's the complexity there? That's the structure of the glass. The glass is a messy, messy system. Not every silica is in the same local environment. Not every alumina is in the same local environment. You have silica and alumina with different number of bridges coordinated to different things. So it's, in principle, possible that dissociating, so putting one of those ions in solution depends on actually what the local structural environment is of that ion. And you have many of them. So this is a very, very hard problem, actually. Now, even if you were able to simulate the dissolution at this scale, which you are not, and not because of the length scale, but the time scale. So each bridge dissociation has an activation barrier of about 15 kilocalories per mole. The simulations at that scale, molecular dynamics, would allow you to simulate hundreds of nanoseconds, so you could stare at the computer screen for the rest of your life and still not see like 3 ions dissolve, right? So the challenge from that scale on is mostly time. So you have to transition from molecular dynamics, where you are basically assuming that the atoms behave like classical particles, so F equal to ma, and you get the forces on the atoms from a function of the energy that we call a force field. So I'm not going to give you a lot of details about that. But you are not talking about electrons anymore. So the next scale over is possibly, there's a lot of ways of doing this, is kinetic Monte Carlo. So in a kinetic Monte Carlo simulation, what you are evolving, what you are simulating is a sequence of events. Okay, in our case, could be a dissociation of one of those bridges. That could be an event. So you have to assign an activation energy to each of those events. And then you can use this algorithm to simulate a sequence of those, right? And at the end of the day, you can have a particle just dissolving. So at this scale, you can already compare what's going on here, the kinetics of dissolution, to what potentially can happen in an experiment. Okay? I want to point out that this technique is interesting because it gives you a spatial resolution. So it's not like a super cursory mean field approach. And it can give you a lot of insight as to the mechanisms. So next couple of slides, I'm going to focus on the work. It's submitted right now. It's under review. That we have done on the bridge dissociation. So this is where everything starts, right? If you don't understand dissolution at the fundamental level, it's very hard that you go up scales and understand how the experiments work. So this can be maybe too much information, maybe too little. Please ask me after the talk if you are curious about any of the techniques that I'm going to show or I use. So to answer this question, which is about how expensive in terms of energetics, so what's the free energy that it takes for one of those bridges to break? So we are using ab initio ND simulations. So in ab initio ND simulations, you still have F equal to ma, so the dynamics of the atoms are still classical, but the force, which you can see from the gradient of the potential energy. Now the potential energy, you don't calculate it from a force field, you calculate it from solving Schrodinger's equation. So it's this kind of like cool mix between electronic structure methods and classical dynamics. Now, what's the cost? There's always a cost here. Is the time scales now go from hundreds of nanoseconds to hundreds of picoseconds. And the length scales you can see there, that's pretty much a state of the art. So 1.5 nanometer side glass. So what you are seeing there is a CAS glass, so calcium aluminosilicate glass, in contact with water, okay? So you have an interface. And what I'm pointing out on the right is different environments that you find the silica ions on the surface of the glass, okay? And what we are gonna investigate is what's the free energy that takes to dissolve this bridge. This is a Q1, so silica with one bridge, two bridges, three bridges. So in the different local structural environments, how much energy it takes to dissociate that. Now, as I mentioned earlier with the time scales, you can run this simulation, absolutely nothing will happen in the time scale that you can simulate. So you need to do some, I guess, tricks, so advanced techniques. So if you have the free energy in the y-axis and you look at this reaction as reactants and products, so the reactants, you have the bridge, plus water acts as a nucleophile, so it's attacking the bridge to break it. And then on the other side, so the products are basically the broken bridge, right? You have to overcome an activation barrier. In principle, you don't know this. So this orange line that I put there, you don't know it, and you don't know the activation energy. So there is techniques which are called free energy methods or enhanced sampling techniques, where you can basically bias the system to drive this transition, and at the same time learn about how, the energetics of this transition. So in this case, it's called metadynamics. So a very simple way of seeing how metadynamics works is by adding computational sum. Basically, you are adding energy to your system in particular spots, and over time, it builds up, and what you have is that the system now can transition very easily because the activation energy is very low. Now, you can keep track of the sum that you put, and that way you reconstruct the activation energy. So this way, you can reconstruct the free energy of any reaction that you have, okay? So we use this method to basically study the bridge dissociation for each of those three cases there. The difference between those three cases is the number of bridges associated to the silica atom, which is shown in blue. So the first thing that I'm going to tell you about is the mechanism. So this is the cool thing about simulations. You have access to basically everything at the smallest scale, time and length, but everything at those scales. So we have that in 1983, Michalski and Freeman, they hypothesized this mechanism that for some reason has been accepted, but really never proved. And in that mechanism, you have that a water molecule approaches one of the silica ions, then it forms this sort of intermediate state where one of the hydrogen atoms from the water molecule is hydrogen bonded to the oxygen of the bridge, and then you have that the bridge breaks and one of the hydrogens from the water molecule transfers to the oxygen of the broken bridge. So, you see these mechanisms, these are theoretical propositions. Does it make sense? Sure. Okay? But you have to prove it. And here, try to do experiments. There is nothing at this scale of resolution right now that we can gain insight into this. So you can do these kind of simulations to try to figure out what the reaction mechanism is. What we find is that what you have is, okay, the approach is similar. You have a water molecule acts as the nucleophile. It hydrogen bonds typically to one of the non-bridging oxygens of the silica. So this silica here has a hydroxyl group, and this oxygen that is not terminated by a hydrogen is because there is a calcium here somewhere. So the water basically approaches that, then it forms an intermediate state where these three oxygens are in a plane, and then you have the nucleophile coordinated here, and the bridge that is going to break is basically opposite and collinear to where the nucleophile coordinates. This is the state that is very different to Minkowski-Freeman. Okay? Here, the water molecule is not interacting with the bridge that breaks. Okay? And in fact, this reaction is very well known in chemistry, in organic chemistry particularly. It's a nucleophilic substitution reaction. So we believe that this is actually the mechanism for bridge dissociation in silicate dissolution. Now, going to the energetics. The energetics are important because this is what is going to allow us to go up in the scales. Okay, the mechanism was cool. It's science. It's like, oh, we understand this better, but we are in the American Concrete Institute. We have to make things useful. This is not useful to you just yet. The energetics are going to get us there. So what I can plot, I promise you, I have the free energy here. The x-axis, it really doesn't matter that much, but it's the minimum energy path. So look at the activation energy barrier for the Q3, Q2, and Q1. Just as a reminder, Q3 is a silica with 3 bridges, and this activation is the energy that it takes to break one bridge. Okay, so I'll move fast. So you have that the Q3, so breaking a bridge in a silica that is coordinated, that has 3 bridges, is the most expensive one. It's an activation barrier of 19.3 with respect to, for example, breaking a bridge of a Q1, which is 13. So that would be the rate limiting step in the dissolution. Now, you have access to potentially these activation barriers for bridge dissociation. That's part of the puzzle. The other part is this relationship between chemistry and structure. So to gain insight into structure, you had to change techniques, right? And you are interested now in the nanometer scale. And for this, you can use molecular dynamics, okay? Now, because you don't have to synthesize these classes, and it's relatively quick, you can sample classes from all over the compositional space. And that's what we did. We simulated classes all over the compositional space, and now we have access to all the structural information. Anything that you want, you can ask, okay? I'm not going to go into details. This is published work, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this level. So once you have the structure of the classes, you can represent the structure of the class as a graph. So in this graph, you will have that the yellow and the purple are just silicon aluminum atoms, and there is an edge if there is a bridge, okay? And what this allows you is now to do an analysis that goes beyond the XYZ, so the coordinates, right? You can do a topological analysis of the glass. And what you find is that, and again, I'm not going to go into the details, but you find some interesting trends. And what I want to highlight here is that the small changes in composition, depending where you are in the compositional space, can have huge changes in the structure. So this is not a smooth thing, right? So here on the left, what I have is the fraction of nodes that are in the largest cluster. Okay, you see that as I add calcium, the network starts depolymerizing to a point where I have basically isolated clusters. It is reasonable to think that when you cross that threshold, the properties how your glass is going to dissolve or react is going to be very different. Right? So this gives us a little bit of insight into how just small changes in composition can have huge changes in reactivity. So wrapping up, here is basically the workflow that we are trying to put together. So you start with a composition, you can run an atomistic simulation, MD, you get the graph representation. Each edge is a bridge. Now, you can get from ab initio and metadynamics the activation energies for bridge dissociation. You put this together, and I didn't have more time, but this is really a very exciting level to work with. You can put that information and perform kinetic Monte Carlo simulations, where, again, you are basically taking this graph and dissolving, removing one edge at a time. And that way you are simulating the dissolution of the glass. And that is something that you can compare now with experiments. And the point here is that you want to do all of this to get to a point which hopefully you can validate experimentally, and then you don't need to do experiments at these scales at all, right? So I'm going to go very fast through this slide, but I'm an advocate of basically playing to the strengths of both experiments and simulations. Not everything that you do experimentally needs to simulate. Not everything that you simulate needs to compare it to experiments. I think that's a waste for both sides. So you just play to the strengths of both, right? The experiments are very good at capturing the full complexity of the system, for better or for worse. You are simulating reality. These are things in the real world. You can reach, in fact, it's easier to reach macroscopic time and length scales than microscopic ones. So let's use experiments for that. And you get quantitative insight. You get the how much. And simulations on the other side, and the simulations, there is a broad range of things that you can do. My simulations, so I'm going to call them bottom-up. You can call them first principles, whatever you want. The advantages that they offer is like you can control the environment and the system very well, right? So you can decouple complexity. That's what they are good at. Sometimes you learn more about what your model doesn't have than what the model has. So the aim shouldn't be about getting to that model that is a representation of reality. The aim should be understanding your model, okay, and how your predictions are good or not compared to experiments. Should you even compare them to begin with? A lot of people jump to that. Even doing atomistic simulation, it seems very legitimate, very fundamental, but you cannot do that all the time. And finally, simulations, and this is what I love in my field, is they allow you to look into the underlying mechanisms. You can control things, you can change things, and you can inquire about how small changes change how things happen. So with that, we'd like to thank NSF, Pranoy, my graduate student Suba, and my postdoc Meili Lu. Thank you.